Great. Our next segment here is actually features two speakers, Dr. Stephen Miller and Dr. Jason Archer. And if you guys will stand by here, I'll get introductions done real quickly. Dr. Miller is Director of Genetic Research for Angus Genetics Incorporated in St. Joseph, Missouri, where he leads organization's research and development efforts and furthers the innovative evaluation methods for the association's weekly national cattle evaluation and other AGI clients. Originally raised on a beef cattle farm in Ontario, Canada, Dr. Miller obtained both his doctorate and bachelor's degrees from the University of Guelph. And while completing his PhD, he was a visiting scientist at Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit in Australia, specializing in beef cattle. Prior to joining AGI, Dr. Miller was a principal scientist with the animal genomics team at Ag Research Limited in New Zealand. Dr. Miller was on the faculty at the University of Guelph for 14 years. That's actually where we first met, and where he led a research program in genetic improvement of beef and dairy cattle, sheep, and turkeys, and served as the director of the Center for Genetic Improvement of Livestock. Since arriving at AGI in 2016, Dr. Miller has seen some major developments for Angus breeders, including the adoption of single-step genomic evaluation methodology, improved models for carcass feed efficiency and mature weight, the development of a custom genotyping array for Angus cattle, that's the Angus GS product, a new foot score EPD, a research EPD for altitude tolerance and hair shedding, along with a new suite of economic selection tools. So it's been busy for sure. Over the course of his career, Dr. Miller has over 25 years experience in beef cattle selection, genomics, and technology. So we welcome Dr. Miller. He's accompanied by Jason Archer. Dr. Archer's consultant and partner in AbacusBio, an agribusiness consultancy company with offices in New Zealand and Scotland. Jason is a beef cattle genetic enthusiast and started his career in Australia working on genetics for feed efficiency in beef cattle during the 1990s. Some of the pivotal and early RFI papers trace back to Dr. Archer. Following a move to New Zealand in 2002, his career highlights have included developing genetic evaluations for New Zealand's farmed deer industry, designing and overseeing a large-scale multi-breed beef progeny test program, and working with meat companies to help beef producers improve beef eating quality. More recently, Jason has worked with beef breed associations in the United States, Canada, and Australia to develop breeding indexes. Interspersed with these projects, he has held roles in research management and governance. Jason's real passion lies in developing practical solutions to make real-world improvements in agriculture. So we welcome both of these gentlemen and look forward to your comments.
Good afternoon, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. So Steve Miller from Angus Genetics and myself from AbacusBio will jointly share this presentation. We'll be talking about some work that we've done recently on indexes which are going to be used to select Angus bulls to use over dairy cows. I must say I'm very disappointed not to be getting to Florida and being able to talk in person with you all. I find myself recording this from my house in New Zealand, at the bottom end of the world. The saying here is one barbed wire between us and the South Pole. But hopefully next year international travel might have resumed and might be able to get back up to BIF and catch up and meet you all. So beef on dairy, you'll know it's a growing market. It's driven by the advent of female sex dairy semen, which means that we can use a much smaller number of elite cows to produce dairy replacements, opening up the opportunity to use beef size over a much larger number of dairy cows. It's something that's changing rapidly in the US. It's not unique in the US though. It's happening all over the world. The pictures I've got on the slide, one's from the US, but there's a picture there from New Zealand where I live and another one from Ireland. Both have very significant dairy beef sectors, so it is an international thing. We strongly believe when we set out to do an index that we need to spend the time and effort to understand the value chain and the economics of what we're modelling. So To do this, we decided to take a study tour of the US beef by dairy system. So Dr. Dan Moser, who was at the time was president of Angus Genetics, and Steve Miller and myself did the study tour in December. We visited a lot of people, packers, feeders, dairy operations, calf ranchers, and the USDA dairy scientists, and had some really good discussions. People were generous in sharing their expertise with us. And then we got back in the car, did a lot of driving, and did a lot of talking about what we'd learned and what that meant for selecting Angus bulls. So we could summarise some of the key messages from this. So the first message is the dairy sector, calving ease a priority for the dairy sector. If the bull doesn't have calving ease and creates problems for the dairy producer, then he's not going to get used. However, probably the more subtle question is, how much calving ease do we need? So we want to penalise those bad bulls, but at what point do we not need any further calving ease? And so where do we perhaps flatten that curve and not chase never-ending calving ease? For the feed yard, growth and feed conversion in the feed yard is definitely an issue for the Angus by Jersey. They don't so much like those animals. They take longer on feed, they finish at lighter weights, they grow slower. That's not so much the case for the Angus by Holstein. They find those animals, they perform a little bit poorer than the straight beef, but not a whole lot poorer, so those are far more acceptable. They do say that these animals need to look like beef animals, though. They don't want those animals that are tall, narrow, slabby. They don't fit their system and they don't fit their marketing. So for the processor, or the packer as you call them in the US, what do they say? Well, carcass length can definitely be a problem for Angus by Holstein. We know it's a problem for straight Holstein steers. That's well known. That problem is halved when we put an Angus bull across the Holstein cow, but it is still there. And so that's something that we need to address. Sunken strips can also be a problem, as this is a flat strip loin which doesn't have that consumer appeal. More so a problem in the Angus by Jersey than in the Angus by Holstein, but a problem in both nonetheless, or can be a problem. Generally, quality grade is quite acceptable. And actually, one of the advantages of some of these animals is perhaps the yield. So we saw some Jersey cross carcasses in in a plant, and those strip loins are actually quite nicely rounded. They were quite acceptable from that point of view. The quality grade was acceptable, and they only had probably 5 to 10 mils of fat, so that's 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch. And compared to the beef animals on the rail next to them, which probably had 3/4 of an inch to an inch of fat cover with a similar sort of eye muscle. So there were some good attributes of those carcasses as well as some problems. The processors are generally seeing this as an opportunity. They can then finish or kill some beef cross dairy animals as opposed to some straight dairy steers and add some value to that carcass. So they're seeing this as a positive. So generally, what would we say we want in a bull to go across these cows? And I think we've got to differentiate between the Holstein cow and the Jersey cow. So for the Holstein, you want calving ease, you want to avoid those bulls which are too tall, and we want extra muscle. So we want this moderate framed, easy calving, muscular bull with marbling, which is, we're probably going to prioritise marbling over growth. The moderate frame part is going to limit our growth, and we then have opportunity to select on some other traits such as marbling. For the Jersey cow, calving ease is a priority as well. Really needs additional growth and really needs additional muscle. They are the two outstanding weaknesses or factors that we need to compensate for. Of course, in the Jersey, height's not an issue. So what we want for that bull is a high growth, easy calving, very muscular bull. And we really need to just prioritise growth over other traits like marbling. The Jersey brings marbling anyway, so growth is the priority in that case. So we want to develop an index which goes from birth to carcass. Now, the two indexes that we've currently got in the Angus beef indexes are the dollar maternal and the dollar beef. And we have models for all those traits in there. When we come to do the Angus over over Holstein and over Jersey indexes, we need to take some traits from both of those. So we need to take growth and calving ease, growth to weaning and calving ease from the maternal, and we also need all the traits that are currently in the dollar beef. But we don't want to just translate those models and pick them up and use them as they are. We actually need to change the set of assumptions and parameters behind those models to reflect the system. So, and we're going to do this differently for an Angus by Holstein versus an Angus by Jersey. So for calving ease, we've utilized the economics from the USA dairy net merit assumptions and created a nonlinear function for that. For growth, we've actually taken both growth traits and combined that to be growth from birth to slaughter. And then we've reparameterized the whole the models for the dairy beef system. So change the level of phenotypic performance, and that has some impact on the economics of these systems. So in this case, we'd be looking at slower growth, poorer conversion, less fat cover, fed for longer, slaughtered lighter. And as I say, differently for the Holstein versus the Jersey, different phenotypic means and some slightly different economics in there. So that's dealt with that, but it hasn't really dealt with these issues that we've talked about in terms of the height of Holstein cross carcasses or the muscling issues. So what have we done there? So we've actually added in 2 extra modules or traits. One is muscling, which I'll talk about in a minute, and the other one is height. So muscling is applied to both the Holstein and Jersey cross, and the height, of course, only applies to the Holstein because it's not an issue in Jersey. So to look at muscling, we've currently got a ribeye area EPD, which is age adjusted. You can get a big ribeye area EPD by one of 2 ways. One, you can just be an overall big animal, and because you're a big animal, you're going to have a big ribeye. The other way you can get a big ribeye is by being a muscular animal, and it's that second aspect of the big ribeye that we really want to select on and get for these dairy bulls. We want to find that high muscular bull. So if we look at this distribution that we've got on this graph, and it's the ribeye area EPD versus the scan weight EPD, the weight of the animal at the time of ultrasound scanning, we can see that there's at the same weight, at the same scan weight EPD, around about 80 there, in that red oval, then we've got a large range in ribeye area EPDs, and it's that variation up and down that we really want to capture. So what we've done is adjusted that ribeye area EPD, we've adjusted it for weight so that we're capturing just that element of muscularity. We're not capturing the element of big animals have bigger ribeyes. What we're capturing is muscular animals have big ribeyes. So on this slide, we've shown this adjusted ribeye area EPD, which we've called muscling EPD on the vertical axis here, and we've plotted that against the age-adjusted ribeye area EPD. What we're trying to do is apply a penalty to those bulls that are poorly muscled, so that are low on that EPD, these bulls that are actually within this triangle. We want to apply a penalty, but we want that to be progressive. We don't want to just have those bulls fall off a cliff, because if we do that, then small changes in the index, in EPD, lead to large changes in the index, and no one wants that. So we need to find a way of progressively applying a penalty which is going to discourage those bulls from reaching the top of the index. So how do we actually do the economics of this muscling EPD? So if you imagine a bull and he's got some progeny, and those progeny have a distribution of this adjusted ribeye area, this muscling, and we've got a threshold in there. So below this threshold, we're going to put a penalty on these poor muscled animals, which have these sunken strip loins. They're not as appealing and they're worth less. And you can imagine the average value of those bulls' progeny is very much going to be determined by the number of progeny that are to the left of that threshold versus the number that are receiving a higher price to the right of that threshold. And that bull's value will represent the average of those two groups of animals. If we then take that bull and we don't take that bull, we take a different bull with a higher muscling EPD, we're going to get a different distribution. And so that distribution in this case is shifted to the right. So we can see that we've got more animals in that higher value area and fewer animals experiencing the discount for the sunken strip loin to the left of the distribution. And so that bull's overall average of his progeny will be more valuable. So we can turn that into some economic functions just by following that distribution through. On the graph on the right-hand side, on that blue line, we can see that as we took a distribution and we moved it from the very left of the threshold right through to the right, we're going to get a decreasing proportion of animals with eye muscles which are, or rib eyes which are too flat. And the consequence of that in terms of the average value of carcasses is shown on that orange line, where there is a function where to the very right, where animals have got good muscling, it's a reasonably flat, but as those animals become poorer and poorer muscled, that function becomes reasonably steep, and it's calculated off the average value of those bulls with that threshold there. And so that then can be used to apply this non-linear function. So we're not going to penalise the bulls that are acceptable for muscle, but as those bulls become poorer and poorer, we're going to put a steeper penalty on. It's going to be a nice progressive penalty, and they're not going to fall off a cliff, so that a small change in EPD is not going to lead to a large change in index, but it is going to prevent those very poor muscle bulls, make it much less likely that they'll get to the top of the index. So that's how we deal with muscling and how we translate that into the economics. So for yearling height, we do a very similar thing, except for in this case, what we want to do is avoid the animals at the very top of the distribution. So in this case, animals to the right of that threshold will receive a penalty for being too tall, a little bit similar to the overweight type penalty that we often see in our grids. So as we move that distribution from left to right, we're going to have more animals that are falling into the too tall thing, and we will get a higher penalty put on those animals. And the net result is shown on the right hand side, that blue line, where animals that are moderate for height and even really up to about the 10 percentile are not being penalised a lot for their height. But then as we get to the extreme animals, we put a much steeper penalty on. So what this does is, again, ensures that the very tall animals are much less likely to get to the top of the index. To get to the top, they would have to be exceptional for a bunch of other good traits in order to appear at the top of the index. So this function is really trying to address the height issues that we have with the Angus by Holstein animals. So that's how we construct the index. I'm now going to hand over to Steve, who will talk about how that index actually works out in real life when we apply it to the Angus population.
Thanks, Jason. What I'd like to do now is give folks an idea of what these indexes are going to look like when applied to Angus cattle. We've developed two indexes, what we're calling Angus on Jersey value and Angus on Holstein value, or $AXJ and $AXH. And these will roll out on the Angus website here later this summer. And these two indexes are actually fairly highly correlated at 0.95 across current sires. But we think they're different enough, and I think you'll be convinced they're different enough, that it's definitely worth having different indexes for the Jerseys as opposed to the Holsteins. One of the questions that I think a lot of people have is, how do these indexes correlate to $B? And the correlation is actually 0.7 for either index. So although they're fairly highly correlated together, their relationship with $B is not that high. So we're going to see some significant re-ranking between how bulls rank on $B and how they rank on these dairy indexes. And why do we see this different re-ranking? Well, partly because it's just such a different cow. And as Jason and I worked on these indexes, I think Jason mentioned the one night, it's a bit like, these dairy cows is a bit like the laying hen, that we need to put a little meat on those bones, and that's the challenge that we've addressed with these indexes, and I think it does influence how differently these bulls rank. So now ribeye has a bigger role to play in the indexes, and I said that ribeye, is related to these dairy indexes like carcass weight was to $B, our terminal index in Angus that's been around for a while. The correlation with carcass weight and $B was 0.7, and that's similar now to the correlation between the ribeye EPD and our dairy indexes. And likewise, the correlation between our ribeye EPD and our $B is 0.5, and now similarly, our carcass weight is correlated about 0.5 with the dairy indexes. So we've got a kind of a switch in roles between carcass weight and ribeye as we move from our $B to our dairy indexes. In our Holstein index, we're applying a discount for over height carcasses, or carcasses that are too long, and we're predicting that with the yearling height EPD. This is the relationship between yearling height EPD and $B today. It's about a 0.5 correlation, which is significantly positive, and that gives us this distribution here between $B and yearling height. But what I'd like to point out is just the distribution of yearling height EPDs that we have in the Angus breed. Up at this top end here, we've got some animals. They're as far from the top 1% threshold for height as the top 1% threshold is from the mean. That gives you a lot of range in the top end of those really high yearling height EPD sires, and those are the ones that are going to get discounted the most heavily in our Holstein index. I drew this fish to kind of give you an outline of what that overall relationship looks like. Again, it's rising and rising to the right, that kind of rising fish there. And now I'm going to show I'll use the fish to give you an idea, what does that relationship look like for the new Holstein index compared to our yearling height EPD. And what you see there is that basically flattens out. That fish goes from rising to level. We now not have a 0.5 correlation between our index and yearling height. With the Holstein index, it's about 0. It's just about 0. How does the emphasis compare? Well, we've got more pieces of the pie now with the dairy indexes, so some pieces are going to get smaller to accommodate those. But I think you'll see there's a fairly it's a fairly balanced they're both fairly balanced in that there's a decent emphasis on each of the traits. With $B, we've got two big wedges there, marbling and yield, and each of those kind of get cut in half to make way for the new traits in our Holstein and Jersey indexes. The first one there's calving ease, and that's right up at the top right-hand corner here. Calving ease has a significant impact on both indexes. Certainly not the biggest. It's biggest piece of the pie, but it is there. And then we get into our two new categories, which would be muscling. In the Jersey is the biggest, followed by Holstein. And here we have the emphasis on height in the Holstein index. And again, that's a downward pressure on the top end, or the most tallest genetics for height. So what does that do to how animals rank and what animals come to the top? And what I've done here is I have ranked each of the indexes. I pulled out the top 100 bulls on each index, and I looked and said, well, what are the worst calving ease bulls that come to the top 100? And for $B, we'll see 4 bulls there that are in the bottom 5% of the breed for calving ease, and they don't show up at the top of the rankings for the Holstein or the Jersey index. So those kind of the worst bulls for calving ease aren't making it into that top 100. What about height? I applied the same principle, taking the top 100 on the beef index and the Holstein index and saying, what are the tallest bulls that make it into the top 100? And in the Holstein index, all those bulls are in the top 1%. And in the Holstein index, there's one bull there that's 1.3, is just on the line of that top 1% threshold, and the rest are below that. So it's effectively keeping some of those really tall genetics from attaining the top of the index. Not that they can't get there if they're extreme positively extreme for all the other traits in terms of dollar values, but overall with these bulls, those bulls don't have what it takes to overcome the discounts they're going to face by being too tall. Looking at this height question another way, bulls that are in the top 1% for yearling height, how many of those actually make it near the top of the index? And I've set $150 as a cutoff for $B and $AXH, or the Holstein index. There's 163 bulls of the 9,690 current sires that have got a yearling height EPD above 1.3 or above, or in the top 1%. 124 of those 163 have a $B that's over 150, whereas only 15 of those 163 have got a Holstein index over 150. So again, greatly reducing the number of excessively tall animals that are making it to the top of the index. Something else that is different from $B is the bottom end of the scale, how negative animals can be. And why is that? Well, with these dairy indexes, I said there's just more ways for bulls to fail. There's more negatives that come into play. So, if they're poor for calving ease, they're gonna rack up some costs. If they're poor for muscling, they're gonna face some discounts. If they're too tall, they're gonna face some discounts. And there's just a longer feeding period. So if they're poor for feed efficiency, they've got more expression of their poor feed efficient genetics over a longer period of time. So these bulls that tick all the wrong boxes will basically compound their discounts and have seriously negative Holstein and Jersey values. In fact, they could be minus 200. So bulls at the top of the index will be a plus 200, and bulls at the bottom of the index will be down around a minus 200, which is more spread than we've seen in our beef indexes in the past. I'd like to now compare the EPD profile of bulls that come to the top of each of the indexes. And we'll start here with calving ease. And what we see, $B does not have any emphasis on calving ease, but our dairy indexes do. And we see the average calving ease EPD for the top 100 current sires on the Holstein index is right around a plus 10, whereas down here with our $B index, it's more closer to, say, a 7. So we're seeing more calving ease in the bulls coming to the top of the Holstein index as we'd expect. The relationship with growth, I'd say, is pretty similar. Not a big change in growth. Height is one where we do see a difference. We've put this downward pressure on height at the top of the Holstein index, and we've seen a marked decrease in the average height, yearling height EPD in those top 100 bulls on our Holstein index. Carcass weight, pretty similar across all three indexes. Marbling is interesting. It's least in Jersey, and again, we've put some extra pressure in Jersey on muscle and growth. Holsteins, you could say, is very similar to $B, but it's actually even a tick above $B. And why would that be when we've actually got less emphasis on marbling in the Holstein index? I think marbling, when we're taking some emphasis off growth and putting some more emphasis on calving ease and early maturing animals in terms of frame size, we're maybe seeing some of these higher marble genetics allowing them to rise to the top on that Holstein index. Not a big difference, but again, it is a bit of an anomaly when we've put less emphasis on marbling, but we're actually getting the bulls at the top of the index actually do have more marbling in the Holstein index. Ribeye and muscle, very similar response as we'd expect. We've put this emphasis now on muscling in the Holsteins and Jerseys, and we've seen the response where we're getting, it's not just big animals with big ribeyes, but they got to have big ribeyes for relative to their size. and there's definitely a difference in the types of animals that are coming to the top of those dairy indexes. What about the values themselves? What are we going to see in terms of the number that we're going to see on that bull? Again, the expression for our $B index is in terms of on a per head basis. So, per animal in the feedlot and per animal in the feedlot, or per calf in the Holstein and Jersey indexes. But the number is really similar. Yeah, plus 200 is going to be near the top of the index for $B, just under 200 for the average of the top 100 on the Holstein index, and just about 200 for Jersey. So the top end, we're going to see very similar numbers with these dairy indexes as we did with $B. It's important to note that we can't compare indexes one to the other. So a 200 on a Holstein index is not the same thing as a 200 on a beef index. They're different. They're almost like different traits. It'd be like comparing yearling weight and carcass weight. They're different. They're different traits. We can't compare one to the other, but the numbers are going to be pretty similar. So in a nutshell, how are animals going to fare and rank on these indexes? At the top end, the animals are going to have similar growth numbers to $B, the highest for the Jersey index. They're going to have more calving ease. They're going to have more muscle. The most of that is going to be in Jerseys. For the Holstein index, they're going to be shorter, because that yearling height penalty actually kicks in and penalizes those tall bulls, and they're not coming to the top of the index. Similar for carcass weight, and fairly similar for marbling, with maybe a tick less marbling for the animals that are coming to the top of the Jersey index, that's focusing more on growth and muscling. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and they can look forward to searching bulls on the Angus website here later this summer.
Great, thanks, Steve and Jason. Really exciting work, and I think these kind of tools work really well for making selection decisions in areas where maybe not each of us has a lot of expertise in decision making, right? So understanding the economics on the fed cattle side, and certainly the implications of those dairy matings can play a really big role in making the right choices of bulls. I notice you guys have been keeping up on the questions through the chat box, and most of those have been answered. I'll just there one here. We'll take one then in interest of time, keep on moving. But Bob Hoke says, good job, by the way. But Brad has a question, says, with as much emphasis as there is on calving ease and the relationship between birth weight and calving ease, how do we ensure we aren't making these calves too small?
Yeah, I guess when I looked at the distribution of calving ease, kind of the emphasis that we're really putting on there is really at that top end. We're really penalizing those bulls that are excessively bad for calving ease, and there's really a whole range in the middle there that aren't really getting discounted too much for calving ease. So we did think a little bit about do we put an emphasis on birth weight, for really low birth weights? Do we penalize those in some way? At the end of the day, we didn't go that route. We're just trying to keep those really poor calving bulls out of the top of the index. For the most part, on the maternal side, the Jerseys, Jerseys and Holsteins actually have got pretty good maternal calving ease. So, we're not really, unlike maybe on the beef side with heifers, where we're maybe putting a bit more emphasis on calving ease. It's a bit different on the dairy side, where I think those extreme low birth weights are not likely coming be too much of a problem. We're pushing muscling, and we're pushing growth a bit, which is going to be a detriment to those low birth weight bulls as well. So,
yeah. And dairy heifers develop typically pretty aggressively compared to beef heifers, right? Because they're expected to go right into being very productive dairy cows and lactate and so forth. So, yeah.
And we could add to that by saying that we do actually look at the correlation with birth weight EPD. when we test these indexes, and I can't recall off the top of my head what the number was, but it wasn't a number that alarmed us anyway in terms of driving birth weight down.
Great. One more quick question here from Gary. It says, do you think some breeders will target these indexes or just use them to sort among what they currently produce?
Time will tell. I think what people do and what our intentions are can be different.
Right.
I think the intention really is this is more of a sorting. I look at it more of a sorting tool than a selection tool. There's a wide range of Angus bulls generated out there every year, and some of those are more suited for this dairy situation than others, and that's what this tool is really to do. So people can go in and say, okay, of the bulls that are out there, which ones are we going to use in this situation? And it's overall, it's a bit of a niche market when you think about it. It's not nearly the same market as it is for walking bulls and beef herds out in the countryside. So
yep.
If someone was to say, this is going to be my breeding objective now, and I'm going to select just on this, it is a bit of a niche compared to, mainstream beef. So, but what we intend and what people do can be different.
Right. This one's really focused towards dairy producers using to sort among the Angus bulls available via AI or walking sires sort of approach, not necessarily a tool for Angus breeders to use to make improvement. So, yeah, great. Jason, Steve, thanks so much for your time putting this together, and we certainly appreciate you both being online here to answer questions, and thanks for joining our committee discussion.
Okay, well, thanks, Bob. Thanks for the opportunity.
You bet. Take care.
The state of Iowa and Iowa State University are proud to host the 2021 Beef Improvement Federation Annual Research Symposium and Convention. The convention will be located in downtown Des Moines with easy access to the airport, hotels, and local restaurants. Iowa State University is just north with its research and teaching farms. Join us in Iowa and experience how Iowa provides the beef industry with innovation to application.